He stood at just 5 feet tall and weighed maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. But by the time he turned 20, he was one of the most feared men in all of Missouri. His name was Archie Clement. Rode with the likes of Bloody Bill Anderson and the James Boys during the war. And while most of his compadres laid down their arms after Lee's surrender, Archie kept right on a killing. He also led the very first daylight bank robbery in American history. But who was Archie really? How did a quiet farmer's kid from Missouri turn into such a cold-blooded killer? Is it true that it took over 30 bullets just to put him down? And even then, he was still trying to cock the revolver with his teeth? And what exactly were Archie's final words? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Yeehaw! Archibald Clement was born on January 1st, 1846 in Stokes County, North Carolina. The son of Southern farmers who soon pulled up stakes and headed west to Missouri, which in hindsight may not have been the best of choices. You see, back in those days, Missouri was basically a war zone even before the war had started. Towns were split, families divided, and lifelong friends became mortal enemies overnight. All it took was a whispered opinion in the wrong company, and before you knew it, you were getting dragged out of bed in the middle of the night. And that's the environment the young Archie Clement grew up in. By the time he was 15 and the war had officially begun, he had spent years in a world where loyalty meant everything, and revenge was practically a family value. There's not really any evidence that Clement received much in the way of a formal education. And as I alluded to in the intro, he was a little on the small side, barely over 5 feet tall and, per sources, weighing in at around 130 pounds. But what he lacked in stature, he more than made up for in intensity. Even his neighbors would later recall Archie as quiet, focused, and strangely composed for someone so young. At some point, either in 1863 or early 1864, he fell in with Bloody Bill Anderson and his merry band of bushwhackers. In fact, it would be under Anderson's bloody wing that Archie Clement would shed whatever innocence he had left, and in doing so, he'd become one of the most feared guerrilla fighters Missouri would ever know. Case in point, on September 27, 1864, they rolled into Centralia, Missouri, and began looting the town. As soon as they had their fill of women and whiskey, they started tearing up the railroad track. And then, once the next train came screeching to a halt, they hopped on board, robbed the passengers, and they removed 24 Union troops who were returning home on furlough. These soldiers were unarmed, by the way. Hell, they weren't even in uniform. But I reckon it didn't matter much. The guerrillas lined them up anyway and gunned all but 2 of them down. And you better believe our very own Archie Clement was right there in the thick of it. Not just dropping hammers, but allegedly even going so far as to scalp the corpses. A note left behind at the scene read as follows: "You come to hunt bushwhackers, now you are scalped. Clement scalped you. Signed, William Anderson." The word scalped, by the way, was spelled S-K-E-L-P-T. Yeah, they signed their war crimes admission with a spelling error. But be that as it may, the point was still crystal clear. Missouri was not a safe haven for the Yankees, and apparently young Clement wanted authorities to know exactly who was to blame. Later on that same afternoon, a Major Johnston rode into Centralia with 146 men from the newly formed 39th Missouri Mounted Infantry. And despite warnings from the townsfolk that there were at least 80 well-armed guerrillas nearby, Johnston pressed on. That was his first mistake. And when he and his men finally caught sight of the bushwhackers, he made the second and final decision to have his men dismount and form a skirmish line. Armed with nothing but slow-loading rifles, the green recruits never even stood a chance. By contrast, Anderson's guerrillas were carrying multiple revolvers apiece. They simply charged the Union line on horseback, and by the time the smoke cleared, over 120 U.S. soldiers were dead. Now, this was obviously a huge victory for the Confederates, but unfortunately for them, the good times wouldn't last for long. In fact, less than a month later, Bill Anderson himself would be killed in a similar ambush, at which point his protege, Archie Clement, took over. Of course, by that point, the war was damn near over. Lee would surrender just a few months after Anderson's death, and all across the country, men began putting down their rifles and trying to go back to some version of normal. Just not Archie Clement. He was still riding hard throughout Missouri, hitting towns like Lexington and demanding their surrender at gunpoint. The mission was no longer really about preserving the Confederacy or even states' rights or anything like that. What Archie was doing, for the most part, was personal. Not only were they trying their level best to humiliate the victors, but they were also attempting to rewrite the end of the war on their own terms. So naturally, when the time came to decide between lying low or striking back, Archie Clement once again chose violence. Only this time, rather than engage the enemy in some wide open field or wooded ravine, it was a bank in the town of Liberty, Missouri. Now I know what you're thinking. Bank robberies in the Wild West go hand in hand. And yeah, that would certainly come to be the case, but back in the mid-1860s, these types of robberies were nearly unheard of. Truth be told, what Archie and his buddies would do there in Liberty would go down as the very first daylight bank robbery in all of American history. And the best part was they managed to make off with over $58,000, or well over $1 million in today's money. But then again, it wasn't just about the money. Remember what I said a moment ago about them trying to strike a blow against the victors. You see, the bank's owners were all unionists, former militiamen who, just a year prior, were hunting down Clement's fellow guerrillas like dogs. And by robbing that bank, Archie was once again sending a message. The war may be over, but you will never be safe. Keep in mind that the state of Missouri was going through some pretty significant changes. Reconstruction was underway, and the Republican Party, backed by former Union officers and Northern interest, was trying to cement control. That being the case, as the pivotal 1866 election rapidly approached, Archie began ramping up his efforts. He and his gang rode into towns across Lafayette County, strong-arming voters, intimidating officials, and letting everyone know that casting a Republican ballot might just get you a one-way ticket to the afterlife. Hell, on Election Day, Clement even led a group of around 100 armed bushwhackers into Lexington itself, firing shots into the air and daring anyone to challenge them. And it worked, mostly because nobody wanted to get shot walking to the courthouse. These little victories notwithstanding, little Archie's time was quickly coming to an end. Then Governor Thomas Fletcher was getting a little tired of his antics, so he brought in the deliciously named Major Bacon Montgomery. Formerly of the 6th Missouri Cavalry, Bacon gained a reputation for bravery in the Vicksburg and Red River campaigns. He was also an outspoken radical Republican, which made him a mortal enemy of Clement and the Missouri bushwhackers. And yeah, Montgomery quickly assembled a team of killers. Former soldiers like George Moses, J.M. Turley, Dave Thornton, and Monty Cantel, all of whom, as Moses put it, quote, had carried their lives in their hands all through the war. In other words, they weren't necessarily afraid of a guy like Archie Clement, and they weren't afraid because they were cut from the exact same cloth. Montgomery and his men formed up in Sedalia and made their way toward Lafayette County. They had previously been told they wouldn't be allowed in, and sure enough, they were met at the county line by armed guerrillas. But thankfully, the rebels scattered without a fight, and Montgomery and his men were able to enter Lexington without firing a shot. Now, at that time in Missouri, there was a new law that required all able-bodied men to register for potential service in the state militia. And in what may have either been a joke or an attempt to bait a trap, Archie Clement sent word to the major that he'd like to come in and register, on the condition that he be granted safe passage. And believe it or not, Montgomery agreed. So it were on December 13th, 1866, that Archie and his gang rode into Lexington calm as you please, ostentatiously to sign up for the militia. The same militia, by the way, that Archie had spent years ambushing. And yeah, Montgomery was true to his word. He let Clement and his boys in without incident. And then, just as soon as Archie was done signing up with the militia, he headed over to a nearby church and applied for the position of Sunday school teacher. Believe it or not, he was hired right there on the spot and spent the rest of his life as a man of the cloth. In addition to instructing the town's children on the good book, he would also travel the state and give lectures, stating on multiple occasions that he regretted his former actions and even going so far as to denounce the Confederacy to his very last breath. And no, that is definitely not what happened. Archie and his men really did ride into Lexington. That much was true. And after they signed up for the militia, they all hauled ass, except for Archie Clement and another old boy by the name of Hicklin. Rather than leave, they instead opted to head on over to the saloon and wet their whistles. Who knows, man? Maybe Clement thought that the deal still held, or maybe he just felt invincible, or maybe he was just plumb tuckered out. Either way, Archie was still in Lexington, and that clock was a-ticking. Sure enough, someone sent word to the major that Archie was still hanging around getting his drink on, so Montgomery sent a few of his men, led by the aforementioned George Moses, to deal with him. Now, these guys were under instructions to play it cool, just to enter the saloon, have a few drinks, and bide their time until Clement let his guard down. But you know what they say about the best laid plans, right? Unbeknownst to Moses and the others, Montgomery had sent in an additional team under a Sergeant Joe Wood. And whereas that first bunch were still playing it cool, Wood just boldly stormed into the saloon and loudly demanded Archie's surrender. And what followed was pure chaos. Per historian T.J. Stiles, quote, "Immediately Clement jumped from his chair and drew his revolvers, as his friend hopped over a billiard table and scrambled for the stairs. Moses snapped off a shot and caught Clement's companion in the leg, then chased after Archie as he ran into a side office, where Moses shot him in the right side of his chest, sending him sprawling." End of quote. Now that should have ended it for most men, but Archie was too damn mean to die so easily. He may have gone down, but he was back on his feet seconds later. He rushed outside for his horse, with Moses and the others fast on his trail. To once again quote Mr. Stiles, "The wounded bushwhacker and his pursuers fired rapidly at each other as they careened down the icy street, past the courthouse where the rest of the militiamen were waiting. A roar sounded from its window and Clement tumbled to the ground." End of quote. Now, it's worth noting that both Archie and his horse had taken multiple rounds. And sources differ, but either that fall or an enemy bullet had shattered his right arm. Nevertheless, by the time Montgomery's men finally caught up with him, they found the mangled and barely conscious Clement attempted to cock his last revolver with his teeth. And I say last revolver because Archie was reportedly carrying as many as 11 pistols when the fight broke out. Sounds like a lot, but this was pretty common when it came to the bushwhackers. You gotta think, they did the bulk of their fighting from the saddle, and they didn't always have time to stop and reload when they were in the thick of the battle. There's a famous photo of one of the Missouri guerrillas, a guy by the name of Dave Poole, who, as fate would have it, was also one of the men who accompanied Clement into Lafayette. But in this picture, you can see Dave carrying at least 4 revolvers. And another former bushwhacker and future bandit, Frank James, was once witnessed stalking the streets of Kearney with a whopping 8 pistols. So I don't necessarily find it all that unbelievable that Clement would have gone through 11 in his failed escape. And just to give you an idea how many shots were fired, at least in Archie's direction, he was said to have been riddled by over 30 rounds, 24 of which were in the torso. And yet he was still clinging to life, at least long enough to utter his final words. Quote, "I've done what I said I would always do, die before I surrender." Maybe. Full disclosure, but there are others who maintain that his last words were much simpler, just a raspy, "Oh hell," before giving up the ghost. It was 18 days before his 21st birthday, and Archie Clement was dead. Per author Edward Leslie, in his book The Devil Knows How to Ride, quote, "His corpse was washed, dressed, and put on display. The inevitable photograph was taken. There is disagreement today over where he is buried. Graves in 2 different western cemeteries are said to contain his remains." End of quote. Sounds a whole lot like Jack Henson, the last guy we covered. As far as I know, nobody knows where he's buried either. Now, I did search for that death photo, but I was not able to locate it. As far as I'm aware, the only existing image of Archie is the one where he was posing with Dave Poole and another bushwhacker named Bill Hendricks when they were wintering in Texas back in 1863. But hey, I have been wrong in the past. Love him or hate him, Archie Clement was about as tough as they come. It took an ambush, a bar fight, multiple gunmen, and over 30 bullets to stop him. Hell, even Major Montgomery would later state that he had, quote, "never met better grit on the face of the earth." Sadly, however, Clement's death would fail to break the cycle of violence there in Missouri. If anything, his death had simply passed the torch. Within just a few years, one of his former brothers in arms, Jesse James, would explode onto the national stage. And in time, the James Younger boys would become household names. Bank robberies, train heists, shootouts, they did it all. And although most folks remember Jesse as the leader, it was Archie Clement who laid the blueprint. He's the one who had taken their particular brand of guerrilla warfare and repackaged it as organized crime. It was Archie who proved that fear could steal elections, that revenge could be profitable, and that you didn't need a war to keep on fighting. All you needed was a target. And as strange as it may sound, even today there are some who view Clement as a hero. Well, what do you think? Chime down below in the comments and let me know. Was he a cold-blooded killer? Was he a hero? Or, you know what I'm about to say, was it somewhere in the middle? By the way, just a quick note on Clement's last name. It's sometimes listed as Clement, and other times it's Clements with an S. So I decided to check the quote-unquote official records. On the 1850 census, it's Clement, just like I've been saying throughout the course of this episode. But then on the 1860 census, they dropped the T and added an S, Clemens. I found who I believe to be Archie's mother on the 1870 census, and this time they brought back the T and kept the S, making it Clements. That said, I did find one of Archie's older brothers on a different 1860 census, and he too spelled it without the S at the end. I could have probably kept on digging, I just didn't really have the time. And besides, whatever his name was, Clement or Clements, he was still a deadly little cuss. And yeah, I guess that's about all I've got on Archie Clement. Real quick before you go, I do have some pretty bad news. Many of you who are longtime listeners may recall me mentioning another history podcast called How the West Was Fucked. We cover a lot of the same topics. These guys are really funny and very knowledgeable. And I say this with zero sarcasm. They are way better at this whole podcasting racket than I am, hands down. But sadly, one of the hosts, Bo, was recently injured in a fire and sustained second and third degree burns on approximately 70% of his body. I don't have any additional information that's not already out there available to the public, but from what I understand, they're taking things one day at a time. They're saying right now that best case scenario, he's going to have to spend months in the hospital. I'm bringing this up because these types of accidents can cost a ton of money, obviously, right? And there is a GoFundMe. I'm going to drop a link down below, but per the official GoFundMe, at least the last update that I happened to see, read as follows, quote, "Hey y'all, as many of you have heard, our dear friend Bo was severely injured in a fire early Monday morning. We're setting up a preliminary GoFundMe so that we can have funds available to his family to travel out here to be with him. We will be hosting another after this goal is met so that we can help with anything else he needs during recovery, medical, etc." Now, it does appear as if 78% of the money has already been raised, which I think speaks volumes as to how many people love and admire Bo. But I thought I'd mention it here on today's episode in the hopes that maybe we, the Wild West Extravaganza audience, maybe we can go ahead and fund that bad boy all the way up to 100%. I have made a donation already, and in a couple of days, once the numbers are in, I'm going to go ahead and make an additional donation with the Wild West Extravaganza Patreon. And if you're willing or able, I know things are tight, I totally get it, but if you are able, I would greatly appreciate it if you could join me. Like I said, I will drop a link down below in the episode's description for the GoFundMe, and I've also sent it out in the recent Wild West Extravaganza newsletter. Look, the way I figure it, we all need a little help at some point in our lives, and in this case, we have a man who, from what I can tell with my brief interactions with him, seems like a very decent man. He just happens to be in need of a helping hand. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got. Thank you so much for joining me, and until next time, adios.